Welcome to our review of Dark Romanticism. Let's go ahead and get started. If you recall, Romanticism is the literature that was being written during the 1800s to 1860s in American literature. Some of the works that we have read, including Washington Irving's The Devil and Tom Walker, would be grouped into Romanticism literature. And then there's also other subsets of Romanticism, including the Transcendentalism and today's topic, Dark Romanticism. Romanticism in general is the type of literature that focuses on the communion with nature and the realization of oneself. We saw this in The Devil and Tom Walker story, in which the main character was heavily focused on nature and exploring nature and feeling at ease in nature. And also the realization of himself and what he was able to do, the deal that he made with the devil, and then again, his independence of his stern wife. In addition to like this broad genre of Romanticism, there are some subsets of Romanticism, one of which includes Transcendentalism. And this tends to be the focus of Romantic literature. The Transcendentalists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman, focused on idealism and nonconformity. These authors and poets focused on a spiritual waking of self and one's individual and unique abilities. Remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson explored that in his essay, Nature, when he said, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Be willing to step outside the norm." And then Henry David Thoreau put that into practice in his essay, in his essay, Civil Disobedience. He focused on how he kind of stood up against the federal government and the traditional ideas of his community, when he was willing to go to jail for not paying his taxes. He also wrote the book Walden Pond, in which he explored his communion with nature for a two-year time period in which he lived in the woods by himself. Walt Whitman was also a Transcendentalist poet who explored various themes related to the Transcendentalism, including the idolization of man in general and the divinity of man, and how man was the optimum being and that they should explore themselves and they should honor each other. Whitman himself was a nonconformist. I often, again, refer to him as the first professional vagabond. In many of his poems, there was a spiritual awakening of self and a focus again on man's individual and unique abilities. In addition to the broad set of Romanticism and then the subset Transcendentalism, there is another subset within this genre, works that were being written during this time period, which includes Dark Romanticism. Dark Romanticism in general is the realization and acceptance that individuals independently were inherently sinful, and that they were prone to explore and express the evils within themselves and within their communities and relationships and things like that. Dark Romanticism, again, remember, is a literary subgenre of Romantic literature. It emerged kind of as a result of that transcendental philosophical thought. You had these authors during this time period, writing things like "Trust yourself," "Man is great," and then you had this other group of literary experts that were saying, "We're not great. We're deeply sinful. We're inherently evil," and so their literature was in response to the Transcendentalists. Their works were heavily influenced by the Transcendentalists, but again, they didn't embrace those ideas. So some of the similarities that these subgroups included, or they shared, is they both believed in the true reality is spiritual. And so the Transcendentalists, saw that as a positive. The Dark Romantics, however, looked at the true reality and said, we tend to be evil. They both believed intuition is superior to logic or reason. And we'll see that in one of the works that we explore today as far as the Dark Romantics. They also both believe that human events contain signs and symbols of spiritual truths. So whereas Emerson told you to look at the stars, Edgar Allan Poe is going to draw your attention to other darker symbols in some of his works. There are many differences between these two, obviously. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see a review of some of the beliefs and ideologies of the Transcendentalists. and you should be familiar with them by now. I'm going to focus on the right-hand side. The Dark Romantics explored the human potential for evil, including the psychological effects of guilt, sin, and madness. So a lot of the stories or even the poems written by the Dark Romantics tend to be dark and heavy, and again, full of guilt, sin, and madness. They believed that nature was deeply sinister, and so if nature appeared in their works, it was not a positive thing like it would have been in Emerson and Thoreau's works or even Whitman's. It would have been a place where bad things happen in general. And the Dark Romantics finally reintroduced the dark side of Puritan beliefs, the idea of original sin and the human potential for evil. Because in general, the Romantics at this time, because of westward expansion and American independence, they had this huge ideology that seemed to be positive. But just like in any culture, those positive people are often set off by people who tend to be a little more pessimistic. And so this is where your Dark Romantics come into play. Some characteristics of Dark Romanticism include the fact that these stories often present individuals as prone to sin and self-destruction. Also, we're going to see the natural world dark, decaying, and mysterious. Bad things are happening out in the world and in nature. And then we often see individuals that fail in their attempts to make changes for the better. Most of the endings of the stories in Dark Romanticism or even the poems tends to be negative. Some of the themes of this writing would include a concentration on horror, tragedy, and the macabre, and the supernatural. And also, the human psyche is attracted in a subtle way to fear, pain, and tragedy. So up to this point in American literature, we haven't had any of that, because of the Puritan influence, colonials, the Age of Reason, and then that positive vibe that comes from the Romantics. We hadn't seen any horror stories or dark stories. This is where it begins to be introduced. And so that leads to the legacy of the Dark Romantic time period and the Dark Romantic authors and poets. Dark Romantic themes still appear in stories, books, movies, TVs, and comic books today. We can, the present day horror stories and movies can basically find their roots in images and themes and ideas that took place in these authors' writings, particularly including Edgar Allan Poe, and we're going to read a story of his in this unit. Another legacy from these authors and poets would be the conflict between good and evil and the effects of guilt and sin, and they are majorly prevalent in these pieces of literature, whether, again, it's short stories or poems. So just a review of some of these key authors in this subgenre. One would include Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne has many popular works, just so you kind of have a basis for who he is. His great-grandfather was Judge Hawthorne, the man that we met in the Crucible. Nathaniel Hawthorne really struggled with his familial legacy by his great-grandfather in his participation in the Salem witch trials. And so that was actually a quite recurring topic between him and his literary peers. There's been letters and essays written about the fact that Nathaniel Hawthorne struggled with that. And that's why we see a lot of his works that focus on characters from the Puritan time period, because he constantly goes back to that and his brainstorming. And you can pause the video here and read over some of the ideas in his most prevalent works, including Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, Young Goodman Brown, The Minister's Black Veil, and the novel The Scarlet Letter. Another author from this time period would be Herman Melville, and if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because he is the author of one of the most famous American novels, Moby Dick. In that story, the main character, Captain Ahab, doubts whether there's any real truth or meaning behind the appearances of nature. And an overarching theme there is Captain Ahab struggles against a whale. So if you ever have heard any reference to that, that's where it comes from. Another famous work by Herman Melville in this genre is Bartleby the Scrivener, which is many English teachers' favorites because it deals with lawyers and authors and writers and things like that. So our focused author is going to be Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's masterful short stories told tales of madness, revenge, and tragic fate. You may be already familiar with some of Poe's works. You may have read them in middle school or even in some of your earlier high school English classes. His famous work, The Cask of Amontillado, is about a narrator who takes revenge on a man who insulted him by enclosing him in a tomb. Another one, The Pit and the Pendulum. That's where the narrator barely escapes a horrible death in a dark dungeon with rodents and things like that. That's one of my least favorites because it's so grotesque to me. Another famous one is The Telltale Heart, which many middle schoolers read. This is a story about a man who commits murder and then buries the dead body underneath underneath the floorboards, but he ultimately confesses when the police come to do a wellness check, and the narrator thinks that the dead man's heart is beating, but it's just his guilt and his sin. And there's a couple, many famous poems by Edgar Allan Poe. Some that you may have heard of before would be The Raven. And this is a poem in which a grief-stricken man is haunted by reminders of his lost love, Lenore, when a black raven visits him in his bedroom chamber. And then another famous poem is Annabel Lee, in which a grief-stricken man ponders the loss of his lover. We are going to be focusing on The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, and I hope that you enjoy this subgenre as much as most English students do.